In the small, sleepy town of Eldridge Falls, darkness clung to the edges of the day like a persistent fog, and the nights were darker than anywhere else in the world, or so the townspeople claimed. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the inexplicable things that often happened after sunset, when the shadows grew long and the wind carried whispers of the past. On the edge of Eldridge Falls stood an old, abandoned mansion known to locals as the Nightshade House, named after its last known occupants, the Nightshade family, who vanished without a trace one stormy night decades ago. The house, a massive Victorian structure, loomed over the town, its turrets like silent watchers, its boarded-up windows keeping a century's secrets. Amelia, a writer with a penchant for the paranormal, arrived in Eldridge Falls on a chilly October evening, her heart set on spending a week in the Nightshade House to gather material for her next book, tentatively titled Midnight Horror Stories with Scary Horror Stories. Her fascination with the house had grown over the years, fueled by tales of ghostly apparitions, eerie sounds, and inexplicable movements seen and heard within its walls. As she approached the imposing iron gates of the mansion, her headlights cut through the swirling fog, casting eerie shadows on the overgrown path. She parked her car, grabbed her bag and flashlight, and pushed open the creaking gate. The sound seemed to echo into the darkness, a foreboding welcome. She walked up the path, her footsteps crunching on the gravel, her breath visible in the cold night air. At the front door, Amelia hesitated, her hand on the old, tarnished doorknob. She took a deep breath, turned the knob, and pushed the door open. It groaned on its hinges, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Stepping inside, she was met with a blast of cold, musty air. She shone her flashlight around the grand foyer, the beam flickering across peeling wallpaper and a grand staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. Amelia set up her base in what appeared to be the parlor, a room with heavy drapes that still hung from the windows and a large, dusty chandelier overhead. As she unpacked her things, the house seemed to settle around her, creaking and groaning like an old ship at sea. She tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, chalking it up to her overactive imagination and the legends she'd absorbed about the place. That night, as Amelia lay in her sleeping bag, the sounds of the house became more pronounced. The wind held outside, and somewhere in the distance, a floorboard creaked methodically, as if someone were pacing back and forth. Then, without warning, the sound stopped, and the silence that followed was oppressive, heavy with expectation. Amelia's sleep was restless, filled with dreams of shadowy figures and whispered warnings. She woke before dawn, her heart racing, and decided to explore the house by the light of day. As she wandered through the corridors, her flashlight illuminated old portraits that stared down at her with faded, solemn eyes, and rooms filled with furniture shrouded in white sheets, which looked like ghosts themselves in the dim light. In the library, she found a diary, its leather cover cracked and worn. It belonged to Elizabeth Nightshade, the last lady of the house. The entries were sporadic, growing increasingly erratic towards the end. The last entry, dated the night the family disappeared, read simply, "They are coming. We cannot hide forever. The house will not protect us." Chilled, Amelia placed the diary back on the shelf. As she turned to leave the room, she heard a soft thud upstairs, as if something or someone had dropped a heavy object. Her heart in her throat, she debated whether to investigate or leave the house altogether. Curiosity won over fear, and she ascended the staircase, each step creaking under her weight. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before her, lined with doors. The thudding sound continued, now accompanied by a low moaning that seemed to seep through the walls. Guided by the noises, she approached the door at the far end of the hall. Taking a deep breath, she opened it. Inside, the room was cold, colder than the rest of the house, and the air held a faint scent of lavender and mold. In the corner, a rocking chair moved back and forth by itself, the creaking in time with the moans. Amelia stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the thick dust motes that danced in the air. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. There was no response, just the continuing creak of the rocking chair and the chilling moans. Then, suddenly, the temperature dropped further, her breath visible in the air, and her flashlight flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. The moaning stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, a voice, barely a whisper, "You should not have come here." Amelia's heart pounded against her chest, the icy whisper echoing in the pitch-black room. She fumbled in her pocket for another flashlight she had packed, her fingers trembling as they grasped the cold metal. Clicking it on, the beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the still swaying rocking chair and the empty room around her. Her breath fogged in the air, and she could see her own breath as she exhaled, a ghostly vapor in the frigid room. "Who's there?" she tried again, her voice more forceful this time, but still, it trembled with the fear that clung to her like the cold. There was no answer. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, like the darkness itself was trying to suffocate her. The atmosphere was thick with tension, each second stretching out interminably as she waited for something, anything, to happen. The room felt as if it were closing in on her, the walls whispering secrets in a language she couldn't understand, the air heavy with a sense of impending doom. She took a step forward, her flashlight beam trembling along with her hand. That's when she noticed it, the mirror on the wall opposite the rocking chair. It was large, ornate, with a frame that twisted and turned in intricate designs, as if mimicking the twisted branches of the gnarled trees that surrounded the house. As Amelia's light hit the glass, she froze. There, in the reflection, stood a figure behind her, a shadowy silhouette that was darker than the surrounding darkness. She spun around, her heart racing, but there was nothing there, just the empty room and the rocking chair that had finally stilled. Turning back to the mirror, the figure was gone, leaving her to question her sanity, to wonder if the fear was playing tricks on her mind. But the cold dread that had settled in her bones told her it was all too real, too palpable to be just her imagination. With a deep breath to steady her nerves, Amelia decided to delve deeper into the house's mysteries. She left the room, the image of the shadow in the mirror etched into her mind, a haunting reminder that she was not alone. The house seemed to watch her as she moved, the portraits on the walls following her with unseen eyes, the air whispering around her in cold breaths. She made her way down the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, her senses on high alert. As she approached another door, soft sounds drifted towards her, a faint music that seemed out of place in the silent house. It was a piano, playing somewhere below, the notes discordant, jarring, yet carrying a melody that was almost familiar, a lullaby that seemed to seep into her very soul. Following the sound, she descended the staircase to the first floor, her flashlight's beam swinging wildly as she hastened her steps, drawn to the music that called to her. The melody grew louder, clearer, as she reached the foyer and headed towards the grand salon where a grand piano sat in a far corner. As she entered the room, the playing stopped abruptly, the silence slamming down like a physical barrier. The piano stood open, its keys glistening in the flashlight's beam, as if recently touched. The room was filled with furniture covered in sheets, and dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by her sudden entrance. She approached the piano slowly, half expecting the music to start again, the keys moving on their own. But there was nothing, only the echo of the last note played, hanging in the air like a ghost. Then, the air shifted, and a cold gust swept through the room, the sheets fluttering like specters rising. Amelia spun around, her flashlight darting from corner to corner, catching glimpses of movement that might have been her imagination, or might not. The house creaked and groaned, settling around her, and she felt it then, more clearly than ever. The house was alive, breathing, watching. Gathering her courage, she called out, "Elizabeth Nightshade, are you here? Is it you playing the piano?" Her voice echoed in the empty room, met only by the oppressive silence that seemed to laugh at her attempts to communicate with the unknown. But then, the piano answered. A single note, played softly, lingering in the air. Amelia's breath caught in her throat, her eyes fixed on the keys that hadn't moved, couldn't have moved, but had somehow sounded. The temperature dropped further, her breath visible again, and she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched, of being not alone. Amelia's heart raced as the solitary piano note faded into the thick, oppressive silence of the room. She stood still, her eyes fixed on the ivory keys that now seemed impossibly more sinister than mere musical instruments. A chill ran down her spine, every instinct screaming at her to flee, but her dedication to uncovering the house's secrets rooted her to the spot. Gathering her resolve, she edged closer to the piano, her flashlight beam trembling slightly in her unsteady grip. "Elizabeth, if that's you, please, give me a sign," Amelia whispered into the silence, her voice barely above a breath, as if speaking any louder might provoke something dreadful. For a moment, nothing happened. The heavy air around her felt charged with anticipation. Then, without warning, the piano erupted into a chaotic cascade of notes, loud and dissonant, echoing through the vast, empty house like the cries of a tormented soul. Amelia stumbled back, her heart pounding in her ears, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The music continued, relentless and unnerving, until, as suddenly as it had started, it ceased, plunging the room back into a suffocating silence. Amelia stood frozen, her mind reeling from what she had just experienced. The air in the room had shifted, it was colder now, and there was a palpable sense of sadness, of loss that seemed to permeate the very walls of the Nightshade house. With every fiber of her being screaming at her to leave, Amelia knew she couldn't, not yet. Not when she was so close to uncovering the truth, whatever it may be. Steeling herself, she approached the piano once more, her fingers hovering over the keys that had just played by themselves. With a hesitant touch, she pressed a key, the note sounding clear and lonely in the quiet room. As the echo of the note died away, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Amelia could see her breath cloud in front of her face, and she felt an. Following the sound, she descended the staircase to the first floor, her flashlight's beam swinging wildly as she hastened her steps, drawn to the music that called to her. The melody grew louder, clearer, as she reached the foyer and headed towards the grand salon where a grand piano sat in a far corner. As she entered the room, the playing stopped abruptly, the silence slamming down like a physical barrier. The piano stood open, its keys glistening in the flashlight's beam, as if recently touched. The room was filled with furniture covered in sheets, and dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by her sudden entrance. She approached the piano slowly, half expecting the music to start again, the keys moving on their own. But there was nothing, only the echo of the last note played, hanging in the air like a ghost. Then, the air shifted, and a cold gust swept through the room, the sheets fluttering like specters rising. Amelia spun around, her flashlight darting from corner to corner, catching glimpses of movement that might have been her imagination, or might not. The house creaked and groaned, settling around her, and she felt it then, more clearly than ever. The house was alive, breathing, watching. Gathering her courage, she called out, "Elizabeth Nightshade, are you here? Is it you playing the piano?" Her voice echoed in the empty room, met only by the oppressive silence that seemed to laugh at her attempts to communicate with the unknown. But then, the piano answered. A single note, played softly, lingering in the air. Amelia's breath caught in her throat, her eyes fixed on the keys that hadn't moved, couldn't have moved, but had somehow sounded. The temperature dropped further, her breath visible again, and she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched, of being not alone. Amelia's heart raced as the solitary piano note faded into the thick, oppressive silence of the room. She stood still, her eyes fixed on the ivory keys that now seemed impossibly more sinister than mere musical instruments. A chill ran down her spine, every instinct screaming at her to flee, but her dedication to uncovering the house's secrets rooted her to the spot. Gathering her resolve, she edged closer to the piano, her flashlight beam trembling slightly in her unsteady grip. "Elizabeth, if that's you, please, give me a sign," Amelia whispered into the silence, her voice barely above a breath, as if speaking any louder might provoke something dreadful. For a moment, nothing happened. The heavy air around her felt charged with anticipation. Then, without warning, the piano erupted into a chaotic cascade of notes, loud and dissonant, echoing through the vast, empty house like the cries of a tormented soul. Amelia stumbled back, her heart pounding in her ears, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The music continued, relentless and unnerving, until, as suddenly as it had started, it ceased, plunging the room back into a suffocating silence. Amelia stood frozen, her mind reeling from what she had just experienced. The air in the room had shifted, it was colder now, and there was a palpable sense of sadness, of loss that seemed to permeate the very walls of the Nightshade house. With every fiber of her being screaming at her to leave, Amelia knew she couldn't, not yet. Not when she was so close to uncovering the truth, whatever it may be. Steeling herself, she approached the piano once more, her fingers hovering over the keys that had just played by themselves. With a hesitant touch, she pressed a key, the note sounding clear and lonely in the quiet room. As the echo of the note died away, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Amelia could see her breath cloud in front of her face, and she felt an unmistakable presence behind her, a weight of sorrow that nearly brought her to her knees. Turning slowly, her flashlight sweeping the room, she expected to see a ghostly figure or some manifestation of the house's haunted past. But there was only the draped furniture, the dusty chandelier overhead, and the dark corners that her light couldn't quite penetrate. Then, she heard it, a soft sobbing, coming from the hallway outside the salon. It was so faint, she might have dismissed it as the wind, if not for the unmistakable human quality to the sound. Heart racing, she followed the sound, her light casting long, eerie shadows ahead of her. The sobbing grew louder as she moved, leading her back toward the grand staircase. It seemed to emanate from upstairs, drawing her inexorably upwards. Each step creaked under her weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent house. Reaching the top of the stairs, the sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by a palpable stillness. Amelia paused, listening, her breath shallow. "Hello?" she called out softly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound calm. "Is someone there? Can you hear me?" There was no response. The silence was complete, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Moving slowly, Amelia explored the upper hallway, her flashlight illuminating the dust-covered floor and the old portraits on the walls, their eyes seeming to watch her with an intensity that was almost accusatory. As she reached the end of the hallway, her flashlight fell upon a door she hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, and as her light touched it, a cold draft emanated from the gap. Pushing the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, she peered inside. The room was small, with a single window that looked out onto the overgrown garden. The moonlight filtered through the dirty glass, casting a pale, ghostly light. In the center of the room stood a crib, old and covered with dust, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. Amelia stepped inside, her flashlight beam falling on the crib. It was then she noticed the small, delicate baby shoes lying in the crib, their leather cracked and worn. As she reached out to touch them, a cold wind swept through the room, and the door slammed shut behind her with a loud bang. Amelia spun around, her heart in her throat, the flashlight's beam darting frantically around the room. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice echoing in the small space. But there was no answer, only the sound of her own breathing and the distant, mournful howl of the wind outside. Amelia's breaths came out in rapid, visible puffs as the temperature in the small room dropped further. She gripped her flashlight tighter, its beam trembling slightly as she slowly turned back to face the crib. The tiny shoes lay motionless, but their mere presence seemed imbued with a profound sadness, a poignant reminder of a life perhaps unfulfilled. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Amelia stepped closer to the crib, her flashlight casting long shadows behind the bars. As she leaned over, a small, almost imperceptible movement in the corner of the room caught her eye. She whipped around, the beam of her light darting across the walls, searching for any sign of what might have disturbed the stillness. The room was empty, save for an old rocking chair beside the window. It began to creak, slowly at first, then picking up a steady pace as if rocked by unseen hands. The sound was unnerving, a rhythmic creaking that seemed to resonate with a ghostly lullaby, the melody hanging unplayed in the air. Amelia's heart raced as she watched the chair rock back and forth, each movement casting eerie, elongated shadows on the floor. "Who are you?" Amelia called into the room, her voice stronger now, tinged with both fear and determination. "What do you want from me?" No verbal response came, however, the rocking chair began to slow, its movements gradually coming to a stop as if acknowledging her presence. The room fell silent once more, the silence so dense it was almost palpable. Amelia waited, her every sense heightened, listening for any sound, any whisper that might give her a clue as to what was happening. But there was nothing, only the sound of her own breathing and the occasional distant creak from somewhere else in the house, as if it too were listening, waiting. She turned her attention back to the crib, reaching out slowly to touch one of the small shoes. As her fingers brushed the leather, a wave of emotion hit her, grief, loss, and a deep, mournful longing that seemed to seep into her bones. Images flashed through her mind, brief and fragmented: a woman singing softly by the window, a baby's laughter, a dark shadow looming, and then nothing but a piercing scream that echoed through the corridors of time. Recoiling, Amelia staggered back, her heart pounding. The visions were so vivid, so intense, they left her momentarily disoriented. She leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath, to make sense of the sensations that had overwhelmed her. Once composed, she realized she needed more answers, and they weren't going to be found standing in this haunting nursery. With one last look at the crib, she turned and opened the door, stepping back into the hallway. The house seemed even colder now, the darkness more oppressive. Amelia made her way back down to the ground floor, her flashlight sweeping ahead of her, the light flickering slightly as if struggling against the darkness. As she descended the grand staircase, a sudden chill swept through the foyer, the air stirring as if displaced by someone rushing past her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she instinctively turned, but there was no one there. Continuing into the parlor, Amelia felt a pull towards the fireplace, where a stack of old, faded photographs lay scattered on the mantelpiece. She knelt down, picking up the photographs one by one, studying the faces and places captured in time. One photo, in particular, caught her attention. It was a family portrait of the Nightshades. They looked like any other family, with smiling faces and hopeful eyes. But behind them, if one looked closely enough, a shadow seemed to loom, its form indistinct but unmistakably there. As she was examining the photo, a sudden sound echoed through the house, the piano playing once again. This time, it was a clear, deliberate melody, hauntingly beautiful. It drew her back toward the salon, as if the music was a beacon. Pushing the door open, Amelia saw that no one was at the piano. The keys moved on their own, pressing down to release the melancholic tune that filled the house. She stepped closer, mesmerized by the music, her fear momentarily forgotten in the face of such mournful beauty. "Who are you?" she whispered again into the quiet, her voice barely audible over the music. This time, the music softened, and a voice, faint and ethereal, responded, "Find the truth, free us all." Amelia stood still, the ethereal whisper echoing in the grand room as the piano's melody dwindled into a haunting silence. The message, though cryptic, ignited a spark of determination within her. "Find the truth, free us all." The words resonated deeply, compelling her to unravel the mystery that enshrouded the Nightshade house and its ghostly inhabitants. She turned from the piano, her resolve hardening. The house, with all its eerie sounds and spectral visions, felt less like a malevolent entity and more like a captive soul, pleading for release. Amelia knew what she needed to do. She returned to the library, where she had first found Elizabeth Nightshade's diary. There had to be more, clues hidden within the pages that she had initially overlooked. As she pored over the diary again, her fingers brushing against the aged, brittle pages, a small, tucked-away letter fell out. It was sealed and looked unopened, forgotten, or perhaps hidden intentionally. The seal was a dark, wax imprint with the Nightshade family crest. Her hands trembled as she carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was hurried, the ink slightly smudged, as if written in a state of distress. The letter was from Elizabeth to her brother, whom the history books never mentioned. "Dearest Jonathan," the letter began, "I fear for our family. There are forces within these walls that I cannot understand or control. They grow stronger every day, feeding off the dark energy that seeps from the very ground. I have tried to contact you for weeks, but I fear my messages have been intercepted. Please, you must come at once. Bring help. Do not delay, for I fear time is running short." Amelia's eyes widened as she absorbed Elizabeth's words. The implications were chilling: secret forces, hidden communications, a desperate plea for help. What had transpired in this house? She looked around the dimly lit library, suddenly aware of every shadow, every whisper of wind that seemed almost like a sigh. Determined to discover more, Amelia searched the library, uncovering old land deeds and maps that showed the estate once had an extensive network of underground tunnels. According to one map, a particular tunnel led from the cellar of the house to the old church in the town's graveyard. The lore she'd read about Eldritch Falls mentioned that these tunnels were sealed after a series of unexplained disappearances. The Nightshade family was said to have been deeply involved in occult practices, their wealth rumored to originate from unholy pacts. With no time to lose, Amelia headed to the cellar. The air grew colder as she descended the narrow steps, her flashlight casting eerie shadows against the stone walls. The cellar was vast, filled with old wine racks and forgotten furniture covered in dust sheets. At the far end, behind stacks of wooden crates, she found the entrance to the tunnel. It was partially bricked up, but one section had crumbled, creating a small, crawlable opening. Heart-pounding, Amelia squeezed through the gap, her flashlight leading the way. The tunnel was damp, the air musty with the scent of earth and decay. She followed it as it wound beneath the estate, the silence so profound she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and what she saw took her breath away. The chamber was filled with artifacts, strange sculptures, and ancient books. In the center, surrounded by a circle of blackened stones, was an altar. On the altar, a single book lay open, a grimoire, its pages filled with dark incantations. Amelia approached the altar, her mind racing. This was it, the source of the Nightshade's power, the heart of the darkness that held the house and its spirits captive. She remembered the words whispered by the ghostly voice, "Find the truth, free us all." Gathering her courage, Amelia read the incantations aloud, her voice steady despite the fear that clenched her heart. The words felt powerful, charged with energy as they echoed through the underground chamber. As she spoke the final words, a wind swept through the tunnel, the candles flickering wildly. Then, silence. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a feeling of peace. Amelia knew she had succeeded. She had broken the curse that had held the Nightshade house captive for so long. Exhausted but elated, Amelia made her way back through the tunnel. As she emerged into the night air, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The house, once a place of darkness and mystery, now seemed just an ordinary building. The spirits were free, and so was she. As Amelia stepped out of the nightshade house, the first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, casting a gentle light over the estate that had known too much darkness. The air was fresh, cleansed of the oppressive energy that had once cloaked the mansion in shadow. Birds chirped cautiously, as if testing the newfound peace that enveloped the land. Turning to take one last look at the house, Amelia felt a profound sense of completion. The windows that had once seemed like blind, staring eyes now captured the morning light, reflecting it back as if the house itself was coming to life. But the satisfaction of her success was tinged with a somber reflection on the events that had unfolded, the histories intertwined with dark forces that had manipulated the fates of the Nightshade family. As she walked down the gravel path towards her car, Amelia felt a subtle shift in the breeze, a whisper, like a sigh of relief from the house and the land itself. She paused, closing her eyes to breathe in the cool morning air, letting the tranquility wash over her. It was over, or so it seemed. However, when she opened her eyes, standing at the gate that led out of the property was a figure. It was ethereal, barely more than a mist, but unmistakably the form of Elizabeth Nightshade, the woman whose diary had led Amelia to uncover the truth. Elizabeth's expression was one of gratitude, her eyes conveying a silent thanks before she faded from view, her apparition dissolving with the morning mist. Amelia watched, her heart filled with a complex brew of emotions, victory, loss, and an eerie reverence for the supernatural events she had witnessed. She knew that this experience would change her forever, that the story of the Nightshade house was not just another chapter in her career, but a pivotal moment in her life. Driving away from Eldridge Falls, Amelia glanced in her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the house clinging to her, reluctant to let go. But there was only the road and the spreading dawn. The Nightshade house was receding into the background, becoming part of her past, yet forever etched in her memory. She realized then that some places, like some stories, are never fully left behind. They linger in the air, in the earth, in the whispering winds. Amelia knew she had freed the spirits trapped by dark forces, but the house would always be there, standing as a sentinel on the edge of Eldridge Falls, guarding its history and its mysteries. As she continued her journey, the sun climbed higher, brightening the sky into a clear blue. Amelia felt a weight lift from her shoulders, yet the thrill of the haunted and the unknown still pulsed through her veins. Her work would continue, seeking out the shadows that lurked in forgotten corners of the world, but the tale of the Nightshade house would remain one of her most profound encounters with the other side. In the silence of her car, with the road stretching endlessly before her, Amelia whispered to herself, a promise and a revelation: there are more stories out there, waiting in the shadows. And I will find them. And with that, the Nightshade house faded into the background, a chapter closed in the annals of supernatural history, leaving behind a legacy of darkness conquered and spirits freed, yet forever a haunting presence in the world of the living. The story ended, but the legend would live on, whispered in hushed tones by those who believe in the thin veil that separates the known from the unknown.